Okay, thank you everyone for coming to our talk. I see a number of people in here that I've seen at a number of other presentations of this talk over the last year, so this might not be new information for some of you, but we're going to provide some context and updates on kind of some of the latest thinking around our advocacy for an EU sovereign tech fund, talking about the report we published last year. And yeah, we're looking forward to talking to you. So this is me and Felix. Open Forum Europe had this idea for a sovereign tech fund feasibility study several years ago. Felix was very involved in the setup of the original German sovereign tech fund. And now we've kind of come together. GitHub was very generously providing funding for this report to help make this case and then kind of start kind of a series of kind of advocacy and kind of policy initiatives that'll help us advance the implementation, hopefully, fingers crossed, of an EU sovereign tech fund. So everything we're presenting here today is kind of illustrative. It's kind of what we're calling for, but this is not kind of an ongoing initiative. It's kind of a policy proposal, so think about it that way. Here are all of the authors. So Felix and I are only two of the authors. I helped stitch everything together on the OFE side, but we also had a lot of contributors, including folks from the European University Institute, Jennifer and Rosa Maria and Thomas, who provided kind of legal insight. We had Karsten and Andreas and Knut from the team at Fraunhofer, who provided economic insight. And then my former boss, Astor, he also was a contributor as well. So very quickly, here's what we're going to cover today. We're going to talk about the study. Felix will cover that. I'll cover the campaign. And then Felix is again going to come back to some of the next steps. Here is our report. It was published last summer in July, right around the time that the MFF negotiations started, multi-annual financial framework for those uninitiated. Please take the time to scan the QR code and go access the report. If you go to eu-stf.openforumeurope.org, you'll also find our mini website that we put up, and that includes a policy primer, which has a kind of condensed and more visual summary of the findings if you don't like reading 90-page reports. And then we also have a kind of very digestible 2-page public letter with a number of endorsements or supporters that expressed interest in this campaign. So yeah, over to you, Felix, and we're looking forward to hearing your feedback at the end.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. So trying to convince policymakers to do something for open source, we figured the first step that's really important is to explain what exactly is it that we want the European Union to do in this space. And just a quick question for the audience, who of you has heard of the German Sovereign Tech Agency? I think that's almost everybody, so that's great. So I don't have to explain to you why we think it's a great idea, but the basic idea is to provide investment for the maintenance of open source basic technology. So the technology kind of at the lower layers of the stack that we all rely on. And looking at the success of the German Sovereign Tech Agency, we were thinking about, okay, how can this success story be scaled up to the European level? So to make more funding available for investments, to get more countries involved than just the German government, and also to get industry involved. And we came up in this study with 7 design criteria that we used to evaluate what kind of legal form such an European sovereign tech fund could take. And I want to run you through those design criteria quickly. So the first one is pooled financing and coordination. So we want to make it possible to have a legal instrument that can not just be fed from one country's federal budget, like we have with the Sovereign Tech Agency, but we also want the EU budget to be able to contribute to it, and we want industry to be able to contribute to it. Second criterion is transparency. So we want, of course, since spending of taxpayer money is involved, to have a really transparent structure so that people know why this investment is being made on their behalf. Low bureaucracy is really important, especially when dealing with European institutions. You might be aware of, or maybe have participated in something like a Horizon Europe research funding grant or something like that. Often, when money is involved from the European Union, there's quite a lot of paperwork. There are also good examples of how open source projects can be shielded from that. For example, like with NGI Commons, where a lot of this bureaucracy is kind of taken away from the final recipients of the support. And that is something that's really important for the European Sovereign Tech Fund to become a success. Political independence means that we want this to be a long-term initiative, because unlike sort of innovation funding that follows certain trends, like one year it's maybe blockchain and the next year it's quantum computing, open source maintenance is really something that's here for the long term. It's the roads and bridges that we all rely on. So this should be something that's sort of set up for the longer term. It should be flexible. That means it shouldn't really matter how exactly an open source project is governed. Of course, it should have a governance, it should be transparent and so on, but it could be in the context of an open source foundation, it could be a loose collective, it could be a not-for-profit association, it could also be within a company. All of these possibilities should be accounted for. It should be developer-friendly and community-focused. I think these two are closely associated. So one thing I think that has made the German Sovereign Tech Agency really successful is that they are from the community and in close contact with the community. So it's not just that you kind of put out a call for applications and hope that somebody is going to find out about it, but whoever is running this fund needs to be closely involved with the community, have knowledge about the open source ecosystem, and that can sometimes also be lacking in a more sort of public service environment where people maybe have different qualifications than those that are available in the open source community. And finally, in order to convince the EU to invest in this, we need to show that it's aligned with things that the EU wants to do anyway. So, for example, improving cybersecurity, improving technological independence, which is something we're going to mention later, and also European competitiveness, so kind of economic growth. And finally, in terms of the size of the EU investment, we recommend in this study 350 million euros in the next EU's multi-year budget, which would be kind of looking at how much Germany has been investing into the Sovereign Tech Agency here and scaling that up kind of based on a per capita basis. This is what the EU budget should put into, and this should be kind of complemented by investments from industry and from individual member states.
This is our minimum. We recommend it is higher if possible.
Of course.
This is the minimum that we're calling for, yeah.
So based on these design criteria, the question was, well, what could this actually look like in practice? And maybe the most obvious first idea, if you want to set something up like this, would be, well, we're going to create a new EU institution, a centralized fund. This was sort of the option one. But what we actually ended up recommending after studying the various options in detail was not to go for this more centralized option, and instead to recommend a more hybrid shared management structure. And some of the reasons for that is setting up an EU institution is a very long-term thing. It takes quite a lot of time. It's much harder to make it flexible in all of the ways that we've described in terms of low bureaucracy, community focus, and all of those things. And it also makes it harder to scale up what is already working with the German Sovereign Tech Agency, which is not an EU institution. And of course, we would like them to be really involved in this effort. So what we ended up proposing is a so-called EDIC, a European Digital Infrastructure Consortium. This is a pretty new legal mechanism at the EU level. The basic idea is that different national governments of EU member states get together to undertake an initiative in the area of digital infrastructure, which of course open source basic technologies are part of. And they are the voting members of this new legal entity, but other actors can be involved in it as in an observer capacity. And this structure is quite flexible. It can give itself its own rules, its own statutes, and can define what exactly sort of the parameters of this cooperation should be. And crucially, this European Digital Infrastructure Consortium can then apply for EU funding. So there can be part of the budget earmarked for open source maintenance, and this EDIC would then be able to apply for that funding and sort of also be that shield from the bureaucracy between sort of the EU on the one side and the final recipients of investments, the open source maintainers on the other side. So that's kind of the brief rundown of what we found in the study and what we recommend.
Great. So I'll share like some personal reflections, which is to say that, OFE, we try and maintain a close relationship with European institutions because we're based in Brussels, and we want to have constructive relationships to help inform them on policy matters, help explain matters related to open source and openness in computing. So we don't often take, very loud stances and really kind of push for these types of positions. But what we saw with the EU Sovereign Tech Fund was an idea that had a kind of wide consensus within the open source community of this is a good idea and something that we could really make a difference by throwing our weight behind. So what we've chosen to do on the basis of this report, and maybe we can do more of it going forward, is really to kind of launch an advocacy campaign. And so really what we've been doing over the last kind of months is kind of really taking, kind of a road tour of Europe and really speaking about this initiative at various conferences, presenting it in online forums as well. I even went all the way to Brazil for a conference we organized, a research symposium where I presented some findings from this research. And really what we've been trying to do is kind of advocate for the adoption of this proposal and kind of making it or socializing it to policymakers. So yeah, this idea began all the way back in 2024, I think as early as the beginning of 2024. And then really what Felix and I kind of did last year was we kind of launched the idea at FOSDEM. We started gathering contacts and really kind of inputs from the community. We kicked off the study formally in March of 2025, and then we eventually published this pretty quickly in the summer of 2025. As I alluded to at the beginning of kind of this presentation, that publication was specifically timed for July because that's when the multi-annual financial framework negotiations began. So that's the negotiations of the next EU budget. That's still ongoing, but what this kind of timing helped us to do was to kind of get this idea into kind of the lexicon of policymakers in advance or in tandem with those kind of negotiations. A lot of the proposals are developed before July of 2025, but then we kind of learned right around the time the study was being published, oh, there's going to be a European Competitiveness Fund. Well, we can start talking about what the value of a kind of EU Sovereign Tech Fund would be in terms of a competitiveness fund and actually how the budgets would kind of be comparable in terms of, less than 1% of the proposed European Competitiveness Fund could be allocated towards an EU Sovereign Tech Fund, things like that. So all of this kind of like policy process actually really helps us to kind of position the findings of our report. What we've seen since then is kind of, a number of different organizations coming on board to support this initiative. So we put out a call for support to our kind of ecosystem, and we launched a cohort in October of 2025 of 40 organizations that are kind of supporting our proposal. I sometimes use the term endorsement interchangeably, but it's not just endorsing the proposal specifically. It's really expressing support for the initiative and being glad that it's out there. If you're interested, please get in touch with Felix or myself, and we'd be happy to add your logo to the website. You can find all of the endorsing or supporting organizations at EU-STF.openforumeurope.org. On the basis of that coalition letter, we sent it to Henna Virkunen, who's the executive vice president, I always get the name wrong, for technology, democracy, and sovereignty, something like that. Ms. Virkunen's office replied in December of 2025, basically expressing kind of interest in our proposal and thanking us for submitting it. We have seen some allusions at events throughout the last kind of 6 to 8 months around talks of support for open source developers at things like Eurostack events, and sometimes it was expressed in relationship to the Cloud and AI Development Act. And then what was really promising for us was at the beginning of January 2026, after our kind of winter holidays, we came back and found that they were launching this new call for evidence on an EU open digital ecosystems strategy, what is kind of being referred to in short as the open source strategy. And so we mobilized to get a lot of people to feature the EU Sovereign Tech Fund proposal as part of their submissions to the call for evidence. And I forget the exact number, Matthias, who might be in the room, might know. But we got, I think it was like over 30 organizations that expressed support for this as part of that initiative. And all that kind of makes a difference because there will be a version of the open source strategy released in May, I believe. They just delayed it today. And then, we had a breakfast at the Parliament. We also did briefings with members of the European Commission, and we're also talking to kind of the permanent representations as well. So really quickly, yeah, here's just some color to everything that I just described. So we've been kind of supporting this through like mainstream kind of media coverage. We talked about this in Euractiv. We got them to cover it. We've been trying to get big names to step up and express support for our proposal, folks like Daniel Stenberg, who's involved with the European Open Source Academy and is the maintainer of curl. We, again, are kind of showing up at these various conferences and various fora to talk about this report. Here's some color from kind of our public letter that we put out in October. And then here's just a sample of the organizations that have expressed support for our initiative. We have since expanded this, so I think there's like 5 or 6 organizations that have come on board since we last talked about this report at FOSDEM. And yeah, here's just some great color to what we're doing. And here's the response from Ms. Virkunen's office. And yeah, we are going around and doing these policy events in a way that's been very beneficial. So next steps, Felix is going to talk about what comes next, and then we'll take a few brief questions.
Right. So obviously, since we had this idea in 2024, the world has changed quite a lot, and so has the public perception of open source. When I started talking to policymakers about open source software in Brussels, maybe, I don't know, 10, 15 years ago, the number one question was, what is open source? That has changed quite a lot, and sort of ironically, to some extent, it's thanks to the Trump presidency, because suddenly the open source software has been very closely associated with this idea of digital sovereignty or technological sovereignty. And that means a lot of people are paying attention to open source software who previously considered it to be somewhat of a nerd or niche topic and not high politics. So if you just look at kind of open source events in Brussels, the attention and the seriousness of the discussion has increased substantially. And I guess to some extent, that's sort of the positive side of the coin. But what is more challenging in this sort of digital sovereignty framing of open source software is that it has also become a lot more protectionist. So there are a lot of more questions about which country are the maintainers of this open source projects coming from. And so part of our mission, and also one thing that has made the Sovereign Tech Agency so successful in Germany, is that it does not require you to be a German citizen or to have a German tax ID to be able to benefit from the program, because they really understand that investing in open source software that may not be written in Germany, but that is used in Germany by German public administration, by German companies, is ultimately benefiting the digital sovereignty of Germany. And so that's kind of part of the challenge that we have to deal with now. As Nick mentioned, there was this consultation in January, which is going to lead to the publication, probably 1 month from now, of an EU open source strategy. And the fact that this is part of the so-called digital sovereignty package also gives you an idea that this is kind of the lens through which policymakers are looking at open source. And sort of from the initial documents and speeches that have come out of the European Commission, what we can say is, on the positive side, this is going to be much more ambitious than past open source strategies of the EU, which basically just looked at how open source is used inside of public administrations. To the contrary, this strategy is supposed to be really more of an industrial strategy. It's looking at the value that open source brings to the EU economy. It's not just looking at sort of the public sector. This, I think, is great. And it's also echoing a lot of what we have said in the study about how open source is positive for cybersecurity, for competitiveness, and for digital sovereignty. What is a little bit more challenging, and this is, I think, somewhat connected also to this kind of nationalist maybe lens, is that the focus is very strongly on productization. So the European Commission wants to see open source projects to be turned into successful European open source companies, which is of course a great thing, but there is sort of the danger that the open source projects that are not conducive to becoming a product might fall through the cracks, and there the value might not be as visible. And the strategy is also quite sector specific. So like there are questions in there about like which industrial sector benefits from open source the most. And quite often there are these transversal technologies that really benefit different sectors. At the same time, though, I think the instinct of the European Commission is right here, that the EU is kind of leading in open source software. So these are just some statistics of public code contributions to public repos on GitHub. And there you can see that EU developers are contributing the most compared to other major regions. And this is despite, for example, the US actually having more developers on GitHub than the EU does. But what is also, I think, really evident from the data is that there is no such thing as German open source or EU open source. You might have a project that is hosted by a European organization or a repo that is started by a European developer, but there's lots and lots of cross collaboration. So this is a visualization of the contributions of EU developers to open source projects in other parts of the world and vice versa. And you can see that there is really this huge long tail of contributions from all over the world. Of course, sort of the link between EU and US is the strongest here, but the rest of the world is also contributing really strongly to European open source projects. And so whatever support mechanism there's going to be should really take account of that global nature of open source. So as I mentioned, not all open source projects can become products. And so our challenge now is to convince the European Commission that as part of this open source strategy, there should also be room for something like a European Sovereign Tech Fund, which doesn't focus on products, but focus on what they call open digital basic technologies. So these are technologies that are transversal, that are low in the stack, and that where the value is not generated at the point where you sell a product to somebody, but at the point when that project is being used. So here are some examples of that: programming languages, libraries, cryptography, and so on. And you could kind of summarize this as tech to build tech. So everything that is below the surface that is not necessarily an end-user application, which unfortunately is often what policymakers outside of digital spaces are the only examples of open source software that they know. Another, I think, interesting development, you may remember our feasibility study recommended that the Sovereign Tech Fund should be realized in the form of an edict. Since we published the study, there has actually been the launch of such a European Digital Infrastructure Consortium, the so-called Digital Commons Edict. Germany plays an important role in that. Netherlands, France, Italy are other founding members, and other countries are coming on board. And this could be a vehicle where a European Sovereign Tech Fund could be realized. This was started, I think, in December, and the Sovereign Tech Agency is actually one of the members of this consortium. So we're quite hopeful about this maybe being a potential space to realize such a thing. So I think we have maybe 2-3 minutes for questions, but thanks a lot. 7, fantastic. Thank you.
So round of applause.
Hi, thanks so much for your presentation. And thanks also for mentioning the call out around not every open source project can become an open source product. I know at the EU Policy Summit earlier this year, there was also a lot of talk about that specifically. And so I wanted to ask, do you see that specific framing with your report being at odds with something like the EU Inc. proposal that's coming out?
I wouldn't say it's at odds necessarily. So the EU Inc. proposal, for those who do not know, is basically like a company law proposal that's supposed to make it easy to found a company in the EU that can operate EU-wide. I would say we need the same thing for open source, maybe nonprofits as well, because like there are lots of things that are standing in the way of successful open source projects. And I've seen a lot of foundations that might have their base in Belgium, but if they want to hire a developer in Germany, it's quite expensive because there are different labor laws and things like that. So I do think the EU Inc. proposal is addressing a real need, but it's maybe too narrow if it's only focusing at companies because, well, open source is developed in many different ways. And I'm not saying that there shouldn't be support mechanisms for European open source companies. I just think it's too narrow of a lens.
Yeah, I would only add that our proposal covers the fact that open source is global and we need an EU vehicle that help get funding to developers all across the globe. There's some practicalities of how that could actually be worked out. The German Sovereign Tech Agency has been able to do it, though, and they're a founding member of this consortium. So, for example, if we could get funding into this edict that could support maintenance funding, you could conceivably think of the German Sovereign Tech Agency in the short term playing that kind of role of helping to get some of that money out the door. But yeah, there is some kind of logistics that would need to be worked out, and I think that proposal is beneficial because it adds to the debate around like how can we do this in a way that supports different kind of legislative frameworks.
Yeah, thank you for your talk and for your initiative. I really welcome the thought of building bridges in these times and to say we support open source wherever it comes from. We don't say we want to build an island here and be like protectionist of our region of the world. But my question is more like open source needs to win. Yes, we can fund it with these kind of new structures, but there's the other problem of public bodies and governments. They need to run the open source. So you need servers, you need people that maintain these, that run kind of these services in the long run, and that's a bigger and a harder problem to solve. Do you have thoughts on this as well? Like, what can we do? What can we do to fix this?
I would just briefly note, like, our report isn't about open alternatives, and it's not about dynamics related to switching or running open source-based infrastructure. Really, what we're calling for is to support the projects that have dependencies in existing digital infrastructure and which are kind of most foundational for digital supply chains globally. We're not really specifically focused in our report on those dynamics. That being said, I share your concern. I think this is a big issue, and I think it's something that we can try and address complementarily, not kind of in contravention of our proposal.
So my question is, I think everybody here is convinced that this is a great idea, but what's your ideal timeline to achieving this? What are you hoping for?
So, yeah, last year, no.
When can we get the money?
So the updates on this front are basically that right now there is something called an ITRE committee. I won't go into the details of this acronym. It's a committee that's focused on kind of a subsection of the multi-annual financial framework negotiations, and they're drafting a proposal for the European Competitiveness Fund. So we're kind of focused, we got some outreach from one of the MEP's offices on trying to understand what that process is like and if we can provide input or kind of help shape that process in some way that's favorable to our proposal. And then we're also trying to understand what's going on with the Digital Commons Edict and if there's some possibility for this type of funding to happen through that existing kind of edict rather than having to start up a new structure. So they just had their first strategic meeting since their new executive director was hired yesterday, I think, and they haven't even announced that director. They're probably going to announce them in the next couple weeks. So those are ongoing conversations. So the short version is my timeline would be hopefully by the summer we'll have more information about those two developments and also about kind of this tech sovereignty package that Felix alluded to, and then hopefully we'll have more information to know what we need to do next to make sure that the EU steps up in this way. Yeah.
I understood the question more in terms of when is the money going to start flowing? Is that right? Or so ideally, if our plan is successful, 2028, because that would be when this multi-annual financial framework, the current one goes to 27, and then the next one would be 2028 to 2034. So that is the budget that we are targeting with this initiative.
So everyone, a round of applause for Felix and Nick. Woo!